On live national television, inside the halls of Congress, Michelle Obama, a 61-year-old black woman and seasoned lawyer, sat in silence, listening as Kash Patel mocked her, questioned her experience, and hid behind his national security credentials. And then, in just 21 words, Michelle destroyed him. A man who believed his secrets, certain no one could challenge him, and his arrogance made him untouchable. Their clash exposed not only lies about national security, but a deeper truth about justice in America, and the injustice that often hides behind polite words. Why is it that powerful men still believe they're above the law, and who will finally hold them accountable? Will this moment be remembered as the day someone finally said, "Enough"? And it all began that morning. The hearing room on Capitol Hill looked less like a government chamber and more like a grand theater waiting for the curtain to rise. Light from massive chandeliers glinted off the polished wood paneling, and the walls seemed to hum with the low buzz of hushed conversations, shifting papers, and nervous coughs. Staffers moved quickly along the aisles, carrying stacks of documents, whispering into earpieces, and glancing toward the center stage where the witnesses would testify. The seats were packed, shoulder to shoulder, not just with congressional aides and officials, but with journalists who smelled the possibility of headlines, and political operatives eager for any soundbite to spin into victory or scandal. TV cameras perched on tripods like sentinels, their tiny red lights blinking, ready to beam every word and twitch of an eyebrow into living rooms across America. There was a charge in the air, electric and heavy, the kind of atmosphere that made even veteran reporters check the settings on their recorders twice. At the heart of it all sat Kash Patel, confident as a peacock, his expensive suit pressed to razor-sharp creases. His red tie knotted in a way that suggested power and meticulous calculation. He glanced around the room with a half smile, his eyes pausing on familiar faces in the gallery as if gathering silent allies. With every minor adjustment of his cufflinks, every smoothing of his tie, he seemed to broadcast a single message. He was the man who knew secrets, the man who couldn't be rattled, the man who would emerge from this hearing untouched. He leaned back slightly in his chair, a posture that signaled both relaxation and ownership, as though this wasn't a congressional investigation but merely his stage, and the rest of the room were unwitting extras in his one-man show. Around him, aides from his camp exchanged subtle smirks, a silent language passing between them. Michelle Obama, they believed, was just a formality, a celebrity with no real teeth in Washington's ruthless corridors of power. One aide, a young man with slicked back hair, even whispered, "This should be quick," with a chuckle, as if the outcome had already been decided before a single question was asked. In the back row, an older reporter from the Washington Observer scribbled notes, shaking his head with a faint smile, because he'd seen this performance 1,000 times before. Powerful men swaggering into hearings certain that credentials and bravado would shield them from scrutiny. The audience in the room laughed politely at one of Patel's casual jokes about bureaucrats, and even a few staffers on the committee's Republican side chuckled, eager to show loyalty to a witness whose connections could be valuable. Yet, under the polite laughter, there lingered the faint, unmistakable scent of gunpowder, a tension that hinted this might not be the predictable script Patel imagined. Cameras zoomed in and out, adjusting their focus as though they too were searching for the real story about to unfold. It felt as though the hearing was poised on the edge of something significant, waiting for the first domino to fall. And then there was Michelle Obama, sitting silently at the committee table, her posture straight but relaxed, her hands resting lightly on a single manila folder, as though it held secrets far weightier than Patel's entire resume. She wore a tailored navy suit, simple but elegant, the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to shout. Unlike Patel, she didn't adjust her clothes or glance around the room for approval. Instead, her gaze remained steady, focused on the papers in front of her, though she hadn't flipped a single page. The only movement was the slow rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the stillness around her making her presence oddly magnetic. To the casual observer, it might have looked as though she were disengaged, or perhaps even intimidated, but a closer look revealed something else. A razor-sharp alertness, a contained power, like the silence right before a thunderstorm splits the sky. A young journalist leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "She's just sitting there. She hasn't even looked at her notes." It wasn't meant as an insult. It was a genuine curiosity mixed with disbelief, because in a room dominated by men who thrived on preening and posturing, Michelle's calm felt like an act of quiet defiance. A few rows back, a political strategist from Capital Insider scribbled in his notebook, underlining the words, "Michelle playing the long game." Staffers on the Republican side, meanwhile, exchanged puzzled glances, suddenly unsure whether the woman they'd dismissed as a ceremonial figure might be far more formidable than they'd anticipated. The cameras caught a fleeting close-up of Michelle's face, her expression unreadable, neither friendly nor hostile, simply focused, as if she were waiting for Patel to walk right into a trap of his own making. The longer she remained silent, the more unease crept into the room. Even Patel, though still wearing his confident half-smile, began to dart quick glances in her direction, as if trying to measure how much she actually knew. It was a silence that spoke volumes, as though Michelle was carefully winding an invisible clock, each second ticking toward an explosion that only she could see coming. And somewhere in that charged hush, a sense of foreboding grew, a collective intuition that this wasn't going to be just another hearing, full of political theater and forgettable headlines. This was the calm before the storm, and everyone, whether they admitted it or not, was waiting to see whether Michelle Obama was about to bring thunder. Kash Patel cleared his throat theatrically, leaning closer to the microphone, a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes as he scanned the room and found the cameras firmly fixed on him. His voice, practiced and rich with confidence, rolled out over the wood-paneled chamber like an actor delivering the opening lines of a well-rehearsed play. "You know," he began, a hint of a grin playing at the corners of his mouth, "the first thing you learn working at the highest levels of government is that protecting the Republic isn't for amateurs." A few committee members on the Republican side chuckled, leaning back in their chairs, clearly enjoying the performance. Patel paused, his eyes sparkling, and added, "People come to Washington with big ideas, but not everyone understands how to handle real national security secrets. It's complicated. It's delicate, and, frankly, it's not something newcomers can just pick up overnight." The laughter grew louder this time, a low rumble of polite amusement echoing off the walls, as though the hearing had briefly transformed from a high-stakes investigation into a cocktail party where everyone understood their roles. Patel launched into a series of long-winded anecdotes, weaving tales of tense, late-night calls with senior Pentagon officials, the weight of decisions that could determine the safety of millions, and the times he personally briefed top government leaders. Each story seemed designed to paint him as the lone, cool-headed guardian of the nation, a man whose experience elevated him far above the petty squabbles of political theater. His voice dipped low and conspiratorial as he hinted at shadowy threats and classified operations he couldn't possibly discuss in public. "There are things," he said with solemn gravity, "that the American people will simply never know, and that's how it should be." Another ripple of laughter swept through his political allies, mixed with a few admiring nods. Across the room, aides exchanged smirks as if to say, "See? This is why Patel can't be rattled." For a few moments, it felt as though Patel had successfully transformed the hearing into his own personal stage, the spotlight squarely on him, and any suggestion that he might be vulnerable seemed laughably remote. Yet even as Patel held the room in the palm of his hand, Michelle Obama sat perfectly still, her face a portrait of calm scrutiny. She let him finish his stories without interruption, her eyes locked on him with a gaze that felt almost surgical, as though she were mentally dissecting each sentence, cataloging every boast and contradiction. The silence that followed his last anecdote stretched a beat too long, just enough to make a few people shift in their seats. Then, in a voice so soft it almost forced people to lean forward to hear, Michelle leaned toward her microphone and said, "Mr. Patel, may I clarify something with you, please?" There was no challenge in her tone, no raised voice, just the crisp efficiency of a lawyer establishing the record. Patel's grin faltered slightly, but he covered it with another quick joke about rookies in Washington, eliciting a few polite chuckles. But his eyes flickered for just an instant toward Michelle's folder, as if suddenly wary of what might be inside. Michelle continued, her voice steady. "In your interview on Capital Insider on September 12th, you stated you were personally involved in declassifying certain documents, correct? Patel shifted in his seat, blinking. "That's accurate," he said quickly, his tone sharper than before. Michelle nodded once. "Yet, in your sworn deposition last year, you said you had no direct knowledge of the declassification process for those same documents. Those are your exact words from the transcript." A collective hush fell over the room, the earlier laughter dissolving into stunned silence as the weight of her words settled into the air like falling dust. Patel tried to wave it off, leaning forward with forced casualness. "Well, Congresswoman, excuse me, Mrs. Obama, context matters. Those were very different circumstances." But there was an unmistakable tightness in his voice, a flash of irritation that hadn't been there moments before. At the press table, a veteran reporter from the Washington Observer scribbled furiously in her notebook, underlining the words, "She's quoting transcripts." A cameraman instinctively zoomed closer to Patel's face, catching the subtle tightening of his jaw. It was as though a crack had formed in the polished mask Patel wore so confidently, and the room could suddenly sense it. Michelle didn't react with triumph or aggression. Instead, she sat back slightly, as though giving him space to either explain himself or hang himself with his own contradictions. The room, which minutes before had been chuckling at Patel's stories, now held its collective breath, watching to see whether this powerful man's fortress of credentials was about to crumble under the simplest weapon of all, his own words. Patel cleared his throat again, as though resetting the scene, and launched into yet another story, hoping to steer the conversation away from the tightening net Michelle Obama was weaving around him. "You know," he began, adopting the smooth conversational tone of a man spinning tales at a dinner party, "the first time I had to brief a president in the Situation Room, I realized just how little the public understands about how this town really works." His words rolled out in carefully measured cadence, but there was a slight edge now, a faint quiver beneath the practiced calm, as though he knew he was bleeding control and was desperate to plug the wound. The Republican side of the committee chuckled politely, eager to maintain the illusion that this was still Kash Patel's show. Patel smiled tightly and continued, describing an urgent midnight meeting, the gravity of national security decisions, and the supposedly vast gulf between professionals like himself and, as he implied, with a subtle flick of his eyes, newcomers like Michelle Obama. Then, turning toward her with a thin veneer of politeness stretched over clear irritation, Patel said, "Madam Obama, with all due respect." The phrase landed heavily in the room, its tone unmistakably condescending, as though he were addressing an overeager intern rather than a seasoned attorney and former First Lady. The words were coded in the same brand of faux courtesy that powerful men often use to dismiss those they don't expect to challenge them. A few Republican staffers smirked, exchanging low whispers, while Patel pressed on. "I appreciate your interest in these matters, but these are complex national security issues. It's easy to misunderstand the nuance if you haven't been directly involved." A ripple of nervous laughter rose and fell along his side of the room, but it didn't have the same confident ring as before. A CNN cameraman zoomed in close, sensing that Patel's attempt at humor might be his last defensive maneuver before the tide turned. Michelle, however, did not react with offense or even visible annoyance. She merely blinked once, her face unreadable, as if she were allowing him all the rope he needed. Michelle let Patel's words hang in the air for a moment longer than was comfortable, creating a silence so thick that it seemed to absorb the ambient hum of the room. Then, in a deliberate motion that was somehow both graceful and lethal, she reached for the manila folder beside her, flipped it open, and lifted a document high enough for Patel and the cameras to see. Her fingers were steady as stone. In a voice calm and measured, as a surgeon preparing for a decisive incision, she said, "Mr. Patel, under oath, you said you had no direct knowledge of the declassification process for these documents." The words cut through the room like the snap of a courtroom gavel, erasing whatever laughter had lingered only moments before. Patel's head jerked slightly, and for the first time all day, a flicker of genuine alarm crossed his face. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but nothing came out for a moment, and the silence stretched so long that even the cameras seemed to lean forward in anticipation. Staffers who had been shuffling papers froze mid-motion. Aides who had been leaning back in their chairs suddenly sat up straight. Across the press row, a veteran journalist from Capital Insider murmured under her breath, "Holy hell, she's going for the jugular." Patel finally managed to swallow, his Adam's apple bobbing conspicuously, and he attempted a weak smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Context matters, Mrs. Obama," he croaked, his voice a shade hoarser than before. But the damage was already blooming across his carefully constructed facade. Michelle lowered the document slowly, her eyes never leaving his, as though silently daring him to contradict the words printed in black and white. For a heartbeat, the entire hearing room was silent, a silence that felt alive, pregnant with the knowledge that the witness who had strutted in so certain of his own invulnerability was now dangling on the brink of being exposed. And in that frozen moment, the balance of power in the room shifted in a way that everyone could feel, even Kash Patel. Patel tried to recover his footing, leaning back in his chair with an exaggerated air of casualness, as though he were lounging in a private club rather than sitting under oath in a congressional hearing. He lifted his hand and gave a small, dismissive wave, the motion sharp and almost theatrical. "Context matters, Mrs. Obama," he said, drawing out her name just enough to remind everyone that he saw her as an interloper in matters of national security. A faint smirk curled his lips, as though he believed he'd just delivered a final blow that would close the subject for good. The corners of his eyes crinkled with false amusement, but there was something brittle underneath it, a flicker of unease that betrayed the strain of maintaining his performance. On the Republican side of the committee, a few staffers let out quick, nervous laughs, but the sound was oddly hollow, echoing in the charged quiet that followed Michelle's pointed question. Patel shifted in his chair again, his confident posture from earlier beginning to erode as he spoke faster, piling words on top of each other in an effort to drown out the silence pressing in around him. "Look, it's easy to twist statements when you ignore the circumstances. National security is complicated. I can't be expected to explain every nuance in a few sound bites for the public or for political grandstanding." He laughed lightly, but his eyes kept darting toward Michelle's folder, as if afraid it might suddenly produce another damning document. Some staffers on his side of the dais nodded mechanically, as though rehearsing their loyalty for the cameras, while others stared at Patel with a faint apprehension, sensing that the tide was turning, and unsure whether to cling to him or quietly back away. Across the gallery, journalists leaned forward over their laptops, fingers poised to capture every word. The earlier note of casual curiosity in the room replaced by a rising sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. Michelle sat unmoved, her posture as calm and upright as it had been all morning, her eyes steady on Patel, as though studying a specimen under a microscope. She allowed his words to spill out and echo into the room without interruption, giving him every inch of rope he seemed determined to wrap around his own throat. Then, without raising her voice, she leaned slightly toward her microphone and spoke, each word measured and crystalline. "Mr. Patel," she said, her tone cool but edged with quiet steel. "I've spent enough time in courtrooms to recognize perjury, and enough time cross-examining witnesses to know when someone is lying to protect themselves instead of serving their country." Her words hung in the air like a sudden crack of thunder, slicing through the carefully constructed performance Patel had been trying so hard to maintain. A collective gasp rippled through the hearing room, as though the entire space had inhaled at once and forgotten how to exhale. The laughter that had tried to sustain Patel moments earlier vanished entirely, replaced by an electric silence so complete that the faint whir of camera lenses adjusting their focus became painfully loud. Patel's smirk dissolved into a thin, flat line as he froze, eyes blinking rapidly, his mouth slightly open, but no sound coming out. Journalists who had been half listening now scribbled furiously, and one veteran correspondent murmured into his recorder, "That's it. That's the moment." On the dais, even some Republican members who'd been offering Patel supportive nods moments before now stared at Michelle with a mixture of surprise and grudging respect, their expressions taut, as though reevaluating which side of history they wanted to be seen standing on. Michelle didn't gloat or smile. She simply lowered her document and folded her hands, her face a portrait of serene confidence, leaving the weight of her accusation to settle like dust on every surface of the room. The silence that followed felt like an eternity, stretching out so long that even the spectators seemed afraid to shift in their chairs, lest they break the spell. And in that stunned hush, it became undeniable to everyone present, even Patel himself, that the man who had swaggered into the hearing, certain of his own untouchable status, had just been pierced to the heart by a single devastating sentence. For a few heartbeats after Michelle's devastating sentence, the hearing room seemed frozen in suspended animation, as though time itself were holding its breath. Then Kash Patel blinked rapidly, his face flushing with a quick, hot wave of color. He forced a short, brittle laugh that barely echoed past his own microphone, the sound starkly out of place in the heavy silence that had descended. In an instinctive motion betraying nerves, he reached for his water glass, but his fingers, so precise and confident earlier, now trembled noticeably as they closed around the glass's rim. A thin ring of condensation slipped between his fingers, leaving a dark crescent on the polished wood of the desk as he tried to steady his grip. He lifted the glass to his lips, but the water sloshed precariously close to the edge, threatening to spill. A camera lens zoomed in silently, closing in until it captured the glint of moisture gathering in the corners of Patel's eyes and the faint quiver of his lower lip. Across the dais, several committee aides exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them about the witness unraveling before their eyes. One staffer, who moments earlier had been smirking at Patel's jokes, now stared with visible discomfort, shifting in his seat as though wanting to slide out of view. The few half-hearted chuckles from Patel's earlier defenders evaporated entirely, leaving behind only the tense rustling of papers and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Patel attempted another laugh, this one higher-pitched, but the sound cut off abruptly, as though he'd realized mid-breath that laughter could no longer save him. He swallowed again, visibly struggling, his Adam's apple bobbing twice, and lowered the glass with exaggerated care, setting it down as though afraid it might shatter under his touch. Michelle watched the entire performance with a quiet, focused intensity, her eyes following Patel's every movement as though she were documenting evidence for a future prosecution. She allowed the silence to stretch just a few seconds longer than was comfortable, ensuring the entire room felt the weight of Patel's disarray. Then she calmly lifted another page from her folder, her voice still low, but carrying enough steel to cut through the air. "Mr. Patel," she began, each word pronounced with the crisp precision of a seasoned attorney. "Let's clarify a few additional points." Patel blinked at her, eyes wide, a faint sheen of sweat beginning to gather at his temples. Michelle continued, unfazed. "On June 3rd, you signed a certification stating that all classified materials had been returned, yet subsequent investigations recovered additional documents stored in unsecured locations." She flipped to another page without waiting for Patel to respond. "On your podcast interview last October, you claimed there was a standing order for automatic declassification, but under oath, you admitted no such documentation exists." Patel opened his mouth to interject, but no sound emerged. His voice seemed to have shrunk into a tight, constricted space, as though the words had abandoned him in the moment he needed them most. The room seemed to lean closer, the tension crackling like static electricity, as Michelle pressed forward, still utterly composed. "And finally," she said, lowering the last page back onto the table with gentle finality, "you've insisted repeatedly today that context changes the meaning of your statements, but in matters of sworn testimony, Mr. Patel, context doesn't erase contradictions, it exposes them." Across the press table, a Capitol Hill reporter typed furiously into her phone, pausing only to send a message that would soon ripple through social media and newsrooms alike. "He's finished." Patel's eyes darted around the room, looking for an ally, a lifeline, any face willing to come to his defense, but all he found was a row of tight-lipped silence and the cool, steady gaze of Michelle Obama. A hush settled once more, even deeper than before, as the realization sank in for everyone present. The man who had entered this hearing room, buoyed by credentials, swagger, and the confidence of a political insider, had just been methodically dismantled in front of the nation. Michelle closed her folder softly, not as a victor claiming triumph, but as someone who believed that truth, once revealed, should speak for itself. And in that moment, as Patel sat slumped in his chair, his earlier bravado utterly drained away, it was clear to all that the balance of power in the room, and perhaps in the public's perception, had shifted irrevocably. It didn't take long for the echoes of the hearing room to reverberate far beyond the marble halls of Congress. Within hours, clips of Michelle Obama's quiet yet devastating takedown of Kash Patel began flooding every corner of the internet, igniting a digital wildfire that no one, least of all Patel, could have predicted. Late-night comedians seized on the spectacle with glee, their writers crafting sharp monologues that turned Patel's trembling hand and stammering defenses into comedic gold. Audiences roared with laughter as skits reenacted Patel reaching for his water glass, only to spill it spectacularly under Michelle's piercing stare. On one popular show, a comedian even strutted across the stage in a navy suit and wig, performing Patel's context matters speech while the audience howled. Meanwhile, memes exploded across social media with merciless speed. A simple still image of Michelle raising the damning document became the canvas for captions like, "When receipts speak louder than secrets," while Patel's image, frozen mid-blink, was paired with the bold words, "Context doesn't matter." Another viral meme simply read, 21 words, in stark white letters over a black background, a new shorthand for a moment when arrogance met its match in calm, factual precision. News outlets replayed the clip so often that some anchors joked they could recite Michelle's 21 words by heart. Even those who usually tuned out politics found themselves sharing the video, marveling at the way a single sentence could puncture a wall of power and privilege. For a few surreal days, Patel's meltdown became not just news, but entertainment. His once imposing reputation reduced to a punchline repeated in coffee shops and break rooms across the country. Yet, beneath the laughter, a far more serious conversation began to take shape. Analysts on legal panels and political talk shows called it a defining moment, proof that credentials and bluster could crumble under the weight of documented truth. A former federal prosecutor noted that Michelle's methodical questioning wasn't merely political theater. It was a textbook example of cross-examination, a reminder that in America's legal system, facts still have power no matter how loudly someone insists otherwise. Law schools quickly seized on the footage, integrating it into lessons on witness examination and courtroom strategy. Professors paused lectures to play the clip, telling students to watch not only the words, but the tone, the pauses, the precision with which Michelle set her trap. "This," one law professor declared, "is how you dismantle an expert witness who thinks they're untouchable." Civic discussion groups, book clubs, and community forums also found meaning in Michelle's performance. People spoke not just about politics, but about race, gender, and the subtle ways powerful men dismiss Black women's expertise until confronted with evidence too strong to ignore. In town halls, citizens discussed how quiet courage can sometimes speak louder than anger, and how true strength often lies in staying calm under fire. Michelle herself, appearing at a community event a week later, brushed off praise, insisting it wasn't about her. "This is bigger than one hearing," she told the crowd. "It's about the idea that truth still matters, and that no one, no matter how powerful, should be allowed to twist it for their own protection." Her words resonated deeply, reminding people that while politics often feels like a circus, there are still moments when clarity cuts through the noise. And perhaps the most enduring part of Michelle's legacy from that day was the lesson that sometimes the strongest weapon against arrogance and injustice isn't shouting or spectacle. It's a calm voice, armed with the facts, and a willingness to say, "Enough." In that single, unforgettable moment, Michelle Obama proved that one voice, speaking the truth plainly and fearlessly, can shake even the walls of power and leave an entire nation listening. As the gavel finally fell and the hearing adjourned, the buzz of whispered conversations swelled around Michelle Obama like a rising tide, cameras flashing as journalists shouted her name, desperate for a comment. But Michelle moved through the throng with quiet determination, her navy suit immaculate despite the hours under bright lights, her expression neither triumphant nor fatigued, but thoughtful, as though still processing the weight of what had just unfolded. She clutched the manila folder to her side, the documents inside now carrying an entirely different resonance for everyone who had witnessed the hearing. The marble hallways outside the committee room felt cool and strangely still after the charged electricity of the chamber. A few reporters attempted to approach, microphones extended, but Michelle offered them only a polite nod, saying softly, "No statements today," before continuing her steady path down the hall. Halfway to the elevators, a veteran congressional staffer, a man who'd worked under 4 presidents, stepped forward and gently touched her arm. His voice was low, as though he didn't want to break the hush surrounding her. "I've never seen anything like that," he said, shaking his head slowly, a note of wonder in his gravelly voice. "You didn't just ask questions. You made the whole room remember what truth sounds like." Michelle offered a faint, appreciative smile, but she said nothing, her eyes distant, as though the hearing was still playing back in her mind frame by frame. The staffer continued, almost as if confessing a secret. "In all my years here, I've watched people yell grandstand and chase cameras. But what you did today, that's real power." Michelle inclined her head slightly, murmured a quiet, "Thank you," and continued walking, her heels echoing off the polished floor, leaving behind a silence that seemed deeper and somehow more reverent than before. Days later, in a sunlit community center far from Capitol Hill, Michelle stood before an audience gathered for a town hall, rows of folding chairs filled with neighbors, teachers, retirees, and local business owners. The crowd was quieter than usual as she took the stage, many of them having watched the viral clip of the hearing on their phones or televisions, eager to hear directly from the woman who had held her ground so unflinchingly. Michelle didn't stand behind a podium, but moved closer to the front of the stage, clasping her hands as she looked into the faces of the people she'd come to speak with. Her voice was gentle, but carried a firmness that filled the room without ever needing to rise in volume. "I've heard a lot of people say this week that what happened in that hearing was about politics," she began, pausing to let the words sink in. "But to me, it was never about politics. It was about something much bigger." She glanced around the room, locking eyes with a woman in the second row who nodded in silent encouragement. "Justice isn't about who shouts the loudest," Michelle said, her tone deepening, resonating with conviction. "It's about who stands their ground when the world expects them to fold." The audience murmured in agreement, a ripple of energy moving through the crowd. She continued, "We live in a time when people want to win arguments with insults, with volume, with fear. But the truth doesn't need to shout. The truth just needs someone brave enough to say it plainly, and not back down." A few scattered applause broke out, growing louder as people connected with the raw honesty in her words. Michelle smiled gently, letting the applause fade before speaking again. "That day in the hearing, I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I was trying to remind us all that no one, no matter how powerful or connected, is above the law, and that when facts are on your side, you don't have to yell. You just have to stand firm." As she stepped down from the stage, hands reached out to her, people eager to shake the hand of the woman who, in just 21 words, had reminded the nation of something it seemed to be forgetting. That calm courage can break through arrogance, that facts still matter, and that sometimes one steady voice is enough to shift the course of a room, a hearing, or even a country. And as she made her way through the crowd, smiling, listening, and pausing to hug an elderly man who whispered, "Thank you for speaking for all of us," it was clear that Michelle Obama's legacy from that hearing would live far beyond the marble walls of Congress. It would live wherever people believed that justice isn't about noise, but about truth spoken without fear. The characters Michelle Obama and Kash Patel in this story are entirely fictional and do not represent real individuals in real life. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental and used for dramatic storytelling purposes only. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful tales of courage, justice, and truth, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me keep creating stories that matter. Thank you for watching.